Good morning. Today we are reading out of the fifth book in the Left Behind series. It is the book called Apollyon, and we're going to be reading today chapter 16. And I'll begin to read now. The following week, news programs reported that stargazers from around the globe were tracking what appeared at first to be a shooting star, but this one, first seen during nighttime hours in Asia, did not streak across the sky for a second or two and disappear. Neither was this hurtling object in an orbital trajectory. Astronomers were found fond of explaining that due to the distance from the Earth of even the nearest stars, much of the activity seen from Earth actually occurred years before and were just being seen now. But after several hours of every amateur and professional telescope jockey in the world tracking it, it was becoming clear that it was no ordinary star. Neither was this an event that happened years before. Experts unable to identify it agreed it was tiny, it was falling straight, and it had been descending a long time. It radiated little heat but seemed to emit its own light, as well as reflecting light from stars and the sun, depending on the time of day. The more closely it was studied, the less a threat it appeared to Earth. The head of GCASA said it had every chance of burning up as it hit Earth's atmosphere. But even if it remains intact, it has a high probability of landing harmlessly in water. From what we are able to speculate about its mass and density, if it was to hit land, it will suffer far more damage than it could inflict. In all likelihood, it would be vaporized. Still, none seemed able to turn their telescopes from it. Eventually, the unidentified flying object was projected to land somewhere in an uninhabited region of the Fertile Crescent, near many near what many believe was the cradle of civilization. GC scientists reached the projected touchdown point in time to see the impact, but they reported that it appeared to slip past the Earth's surface into a deep crevice. Aerial studies of the area showed the impossibility of vehicular or foot traffic to more closely evaluate the object and its effect or lack thereof on the Earth's crust. As planes circled and shot still pictures and videotape, however, a geological eruption registered high on the Richter scale of seismology sensors all over the world. This thing that fell to Earth, whatever it was, had somehow triggered volcano like activity deep beneath the Earth's surface. The shock wave alone blew the surveillance planes off course and forced their pilots to fight to stay airborne and escape the area. Astounding scientists, the first evidence of what happened beneath the Earth was a mushroom cloud 1,000 times bigger and launched with that much more power and speed than any in history, produced by bombs or natural phenomena. Also unique about this eruption was that it came from the crevice below sea level rather than from the typical volcanic mountain. Cameras 1,000 miles from the source of the cloud picked up images of it within 12 hours. Rather than being carried on indiscriminate winds, this cloud, massive and growing, fed from the belching earth, spreading equally in all directions, and threatened to block the sun all over the globe. And this was no smoky cloud that thinned and dissipated as it traveled. The thick fumes that gushed from the ground were dense and black like the base of a gasoline fire. Scientists feared the source of the smoke was a colossal fire that would eventually rise and shoot flames miles into the air. Early the following morning, Early the following Monday afternoon in Jerusalem, Buck was devastated to learn that his flight to Athens and then on to the States had been canceled. The billowing cloud of smoke that blanketed the earth had affected daylight again. Buck had looked forward to a 2-hour layover during which he could meet Lucas Miklos. He was then to switch planes and fly nonstop the rest of the way to Chicago's Midway Airport. He was to proceed from there to Mount Prospect, only after determining that he would not lead any enemies to the safe house. He and stateside members of the Tribulation Force had developed options to misdirect tails and shake them free. Instead, Buck hurried to Chaim Rosenzweig's home under the cover of darkness. Be wary of Carpathia's claim that you are not still a suspect, Chaim said. Nikolai is not speaking to me, Leon is fuming. While they cannot casually renegade on their agreement, they will soon find some jurisdiction. Don't worry, I'm so eager to see Chloe I may fly under my own power. Be careful of Enigma Babylon. What's Peter up to now? You haven't heard? Buck shook his head. Too busy getting ready to go. Chaim turned on the TV. I could quote this by heart. I've heard it so many times today. It's the only thing in the news outside the smoking volcano. Matthews, in full clerical regalia again, spoke to the camera. The global community may have a tacit agreement with black magic religious terrorists, but the time has come to enforce the law. Enigma Babylon, One World Faith, is the accepted religion for the whole world. As much as it is in my power, and a careful reading of the Global Community Charter reveals that this clearly falls within my purview, I will prosecute offenders. So that all may be clear, I consider exclusive, intolerant, one-way only beliefs antithetical to true religion. If because of misplaced diplomacy the global community administration feels it must allow diversions from cosmic truth, Enigma Babylon itself must go on the offensive. To be an atheist or an agnostic is one thing. Even they are welcome beneath our all-inclusive banner. But it is illegal to practice a form of religion that flies in the face of our mission. Such practitioners and their followers will suffer. As a first initiative in a sweeping effort to rid the world of intolerance, it shall be deemed criminal as of midnight Tuesday, Greenwich Mean Time, for anyone visit the website of the so-called Tribulation Force, the teaching of this cult's guru, Dr. Tyson Ben Judah, are poison to people of true faith and love, and we will not tolerate their deadly toxin pushed like a drug. Technology is in a place that can monitor the internet activity of any citizen, and those whose records show they have accessed this site after the deadline shall be subject to fine and imprisonment. A global community reporter interrupted. Two-part question, Supreme Pontiff. 1. How does imprisoning people for what they access on the web jibe with tolerance, faith, and love? And 2. If you can monitor everyone's internet activity, why can't you trace where Ben Judah transmits from and shut him down? I'm sorry, one of his aides said as Peter II was ushered away, but we established in advance that we would not have time for questions. I'd like to get a peek at that reporter's forehead, Buck thought. It made him wish his cover had not been blown and that he was still working from the inside. It was early morning in the Chicago area as Rayford pulled away from the safe house in Buck's Range Rover. Despite the smoky skies, he felt he had to get to Milwaukee and check on the condition of Ken Ritz's Suburban. It seemed in a better shape than the Rover. The Tribulation Force could use it, but Rayford didn't know how a dead man's belongings should be disposed of, especially those of a man with no living kin. Rayford suddenly heard a voice, as if someone were in the car with him. The radio was off and he was alone, but he heard clear as from the best sound system available, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth," because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the three angels who were about to sound. His phone chirped. It was David from New Babylon. Captain Steele, I'm outside right now, and I don't know what kind of spin we're going to put on this one, but I'll bet my life it'll never make the news. I heard it. It doesn't have to make the news. Everybody in here saw it before we heard it. Well, at least our equipment detected it. We can't see a thing through this cloud of smoke, but because we have huge radio receivers pointed at the sky anyway, it was plain as day here. I asked a Turkish guy what language it was in, and he said his own. Well, I heard it in English, so you know what I think. You saw the angel? Okay, we worked all night because somebody's probe detected something. The digital facsimile made it look like some sort of heavenly body, a comet or something. He gets it all tracked in and measured and whatnot, and we all start studying it. Well, I'm no astronomer, so I haven't got a clue what I'm looking at. I tell him it looks real small to me and not very thick. They're all congratulating me because it gave the lead guy an idea. He says, all right, let's assume it's closer and smaller, a lot smaller. So he turns the dials and resets the probe, and all of a sudden the computer is spitting out images we can see and understand. It looked transparent and sort of human-like, but not really. Anyway, we're following this thing, and then the boss says to point all the radio satellite dishes at it and try to track it that way. The way we do the stars in the daylight. Next thing you know, we hear the announcement. Well, it's all staticky and crackly, and we missed the first word. But of course, I've been reading Dr. Ben Judah's stuff, so I know what it is. Because the next two words are the same and clear, I'm telling you, Captain. It freaked out everybody, and I mean everybody. Guys were on the floor crying. They've been playing the tape over and over in there, and I even copied it on my dictation machine. But you know what? It records only in Greek. Everybody heard it in its own language, but it was Greek. Buck heard the angel and mistook it for the TV until he saw the look on James' face. The old man was terrified. How could he or anyone doubt the existence of God? Now, this was no longer about ignorance, it was about choice. Brayford parked near the hangar where Ken Ritz had lived before moving to the safe house. There, he heard under the hood of Ritz's his head under the hood of Ritz's Suburban was Ernie, the new believer. He looked up and squinted through the haze as Rayford approached. Ernie smiled, shook his hand with enthusiasm, and pushed his greasy hat back on his head. The mark of his forehead stood out clearly as if he was proud of it, but he was also shivering. That was scary, wasn't it? He said. Shouldn't be to those who knew it was coming, Rayford said. You have something to fear. Not even death. You have nothing to fear, not even death. None of us wants to die, but we know what comes next. Yeah, Ernie said, adjusting his hat again. But still, how's Ken's car doing? Ernie turned back to the engine. Pretty good shape for all it's been through, I'd say. You find this therapeutic? I'm sorry, Ernie said. I was never much of a student. What's that mean? Does it help you remember Ken without it being too painful for you? Oh, well, I didn't really know him that long. I mean, I was shocked and I'll miss him, but I just did stuff for him. He paid me, you know. But you both became believers. Yeah, that was good. He put me onto that Ben Judah guy's website. A car pulled up to the rebuilt tower across the way, and two men in shirts and ties got out. One was tall and black, the other stocky and white. The first one went into the tower. The other approached Ernie and Rayford. Ernie emerged from under the hood and pulled his cap low across his brow. Hey, Bo, he said. Do you hear the voice out of the sky? I heard it, Bo said, obviously disgusted. If you believe it was a voice from the sky, you're loopier than I thought. Well, what was it then? Ernie said, as Bo studied Rayford. Those crazy fundamentalists again, playing with our minds, some kind of loudspeaker trick. Don't fall for it. Ernie emitted an embarrassed laugh and looked self-consciously at Ray. Howdy, Bo said, nodding to Rayford. Can I help you with something? No thanks, just a friend of Kinred's. Yeah, that was awful. Actually, I just came by to see about his belongings. I don't believe there were any living relatives. Ernie straightened up and turned around so quickly that even Bo seemed taken aback. It was clear both wanted to say something, but each looked at the other and hesitated. Then they both spoke at once. Bo said, "And so you just thought you'd come by and see what you could," while Ernie was while Ernie was saying, "No, that's right. No relatives, in fact. He told me just a week or so ago that." Ernie conceded the floor first, and the man backed up and finished his thought. "You'd come by and see what you could make of with, is that it?" Rayford recoiled at such insensitivity, especially on the part of a stranger. "That's not it at all, sir. Where do you get off calling me sir? You don't know me." Caught off guard, Rayford's old nature took over. "What am I talking to, an alien? How does polite society refer to strangers on your planet, Bo?" He hit the name with as much sarcasm as he could muster. Rayford was much taller, but Bo was built like a linebacker. With his blond crew cut, he looked the part, too. "Why don't you just take your opportunist tail out of here while it's still part of your body?" Bo said. Rayford was boiling and repenting of his attitude even as he spewed venom. "Why don't you mind your own business while I talk privately with Ernie?" Bo stepped closer to Rayford and made him wonder if he would have to defend himself. "Because Ernie's on my payroll," Bo said, "and everything on this property is my business, including Ritz's effects." Rayford took a deep breath and regained control of his emotions. "Then I'll be happy to talk to Ernie on his own time and on his own property," Bo added. "Fine, but what gives you the right to Ken Ritz's stuff? What gives you any right to it?" "I haven't claimed any rights to it," Rayford said, "but I think its disposition is a valid question." Ernie looked ill. Um, Bo, sir, Ken told me that if anything ever happened to him, I would have his stuff." "Yeah, right. He did. The planes, his car, his personal junk, whatever I wanted." Rayford looked suspiciously at Ernie. He didn't want to question a fellow believer, especially in front of an outsider, but he had to. "I thought you told me you two hardly knew each other." "I'll handle this," Bo said. "That's bull, Ernie, and you know it. Ritz was part owner of this airport, and—" Rayford cocked his head quickly. That didn't mesh with what Ken had told Rayford about wanting to buy the place. Bo must have noticed Rayford's reaction and assumed he knew more than Bo thought. "Well," he adjusted midstream, "he made an offer anyway, or was going to. Actually, yeah, an offer was made. So if there are assets in his estate, that would be the property of Pewaukee ownership." Rayford felt his blood boil again. "Oh, that makes a lot of sense. He dies before your deal is consummated, so you take his estate in exchange for what? You're going to change the name of the place to Ritz Memorial? You take his assets and he gets what? Posthumous ownership while you run it for him and take the profits? So what's your stake in this, smarty pants?" Rayford nearly laughed. Was he back on the playground in fourth grade? How had he come to a shouting match with a total stranger? "As I said, I made no claim, but my stake now is to be sure nothing happens to my friend's legacy that he didn't intend to happen." "He intended for me to have it," Ernie said. "I told you that." "Ernie," Bo said, "stick to your grease monkeying and keep your nose out of this, will you? And wipe that smudge off your forehead. You look like a snot-nosed rugrat." Ernie tugged down on his cap and whirled around to busy himself under the hood again. He was muttering. "I'm taking this stuff he said I could have. I'll tell you that right now. You're not bullying me into giving up what I know is rightfully mine. No way." Rayford was disgusted with Ernie's obvious lies, but even more so that he was ashamed of the mark of God. And then it hit him. Only other believers could see the mark. Was Rayford arguing with a fellow tribulation saint? He looked quickly at Bo's forehead, which, because of his haircut and his complexion and the breadth of his face, had been right in front of Rayford's eyes the whole time, even in the dense smog. Bo's skin was as clear as a baby's. Buck felt restless. He sat across from Chain Rosenzweig in the parlor of his estate and was nearly overcome with compassion for the man. Doctor, he said, how can you see and know and experience all we have endured, all of us, even you, these last few years, and yet still resist the call of God on your life? Don't be offended. You know I care for you, as does Tyson and my wife and her father. You told an international audience on TV that Ben Judah was proven correct in his interpretations of what is to come. Forgive me for being so forward, but the time is growing short. I confess I have been troubled, Rosenzweig said, especially since Ben Judah stayed with me. You have heard my arguments against God in the past. But no, not even I can deny he is at work today. It is too plain. But I have to say I don't understand your God. He seems mean-spirited to me. Why can he not get people's attention through wonderful miracles as he did in the Bible? Why make things worse and worse until a person has no choice? I find myself resisting being forced into this by the very one who wants my devotion. I want to come willingly on my own accord, if at all. Buck stood and pulled back the drape. The skies were growing darker, and he heard a low rumble in the distance. Should he stay away from the window? The weather has not portended rain. What was the noise? He could see no more than 10 feet through the heavy smoke. Doctor, God has blessed you beyond what any human deserves. If your wealth of friends, education, knowledge, creativity, challenge, admiration, income, and comfort do not draw you to him, what else can he do? He is not willing that any should perish, and so he resorts to judgments that will drive them to him or away from him forever. We're praying you will choose the former. Rosenzweig appeared older than his age, weary, drawn, lonely. He looked like he needed rest. But life was hard everywhere. Buck knew everything would head downhill from here. The old man crossed his legs and appeared uncomfortable and set his feet flat on the floor again. He seemed distracted, and he and Buck had to raise their voices to even hear each other. I must tell you that your praying for me means more than I can. He furrowed his brow. What is that noise? The rumble had become higher pitched and had developed a metallic sound. It sounds like chains clanging together, Buck said. A low-flying craft? The airports are closed, Doctor. It's getting louder and it's darker. It's dark as night out there. Open that drape all the way, Cameron. Please, oh my heavens! The sky was black as pitch and the racket deafening. Buck spun to look at Chaim, whose face matched Buck's own terror. Metal against metal clanged until both men covered their ears. Rattling, thumping against the windows now, the rumble had become a cacophony of piercing, irritating, rattling, jangling that seemed it would invade the very walls. Buck stared out the window, and his heart thundered against his ribs. From out of the smoke came flying creatures, hideous, ugly, brown and black and yellow flying monsters, swarming like locusts. They looked like miniature horses, 5 or 6 inches long, with tails like those of scorpions. Most horrifying, the creatures were attacking, trying to get in, and they looked past Buck as if Chaim was their target. The old man stood in the middle of the room. Cameron, they are after me, he screamed. Tell me I'm dreaming. Tell me it's only a nightmare. The creatures hovered, beating their wings and driving their heads into the window. I'm sorry, Doctor, Buck said, shuddering, his arms covered with goose flesh. This is real. It's the first of 3 woes the angels warned about. What do they want? What will they do? Tyson teaches that they will not harm any foliage like locusts usually do, but only those who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Chaim paled, and Buck worried he might collapse. Sit down, sir. Let me open the window. No, keep them out. I can tell they mean to devour me. Maybe we can trap 1 or 2 between the screens and the windows and see them more clearly. I don't want to see them. I want to kill them before they kill me. Chaim, they have not been given the authority to kill you. How do you know? He sounded like a schoolboy now, doubting the doctor who's told him a shot won't hurt. I won't tell you they won't torment you, but the Bible says the victims they attack will want to die and be unable to. Oh no! Buck turned a crank that swung upon the window. Several creatures flew near the screen, and he quickly shut the window. Now trapped between, they flew crazily, straining, fighting, banging off each other. The harsh metallic sound increased. Aren't you the least bit curious? Buck said, fighting to not turn from the sight of them. They are fascinating hybrids. As a scientist, don't you want to at least see? I'll be right back, Chang cried, and he hurried away. He returned, looking ridiculous, dressed head to toe in beekeeping garb, boots, bulky canvas, body smock, gloves, hat with face mesh, and material covering his neck. He carried a cricket bat. Blood-curdling screams rose above the clamor. Chang rushed to the other window, threw back the drape, and fell to his knees. Oh, God, he prayed, save me from these creatures, and don't let Jonas die. Buck looked over Chang's shoulder out to the gate. Jonas lay writhing, screaming, thrashing, slapping at his legs and torso, trying to cover his face. He was covered with the locusts. We've got to get him inside, Buck said. I can't go out. They'll attack me. Buck hesitated. He believed he was invulnerable to the creature's stings, but his mind had trouble communicating that to his legs. I'll go, he said. How will you keep the creatures out? I can only do the best I can. Do you have another bat? No, but I have a tennis racket. That'll have to do. Buck headed downstairs with the racket. Chang called after him. I'm going to lock myself in this room. Be sure you've killed or kept out all of them before coming back in. And put Jonas in the front guest room. Will he die? He'll wish he could, Buck said. He waited at the front door. The smoke that had hung over the city for days was gone, having left just as dense a spread of ghastly beings. Praying for courage, Buck opened the door and ran to Jonas, who now lay quivering and twitching. Jonas, let's get you inside. But he was unconscious. Buck set the racket down and used both hands to grab the big man by the shoulder and roll him over. His face showed one welt, and he was beginning to swell. A barrel-chested, beefy man, Jonas was going to be difficult to move. Buck tried to remember the fireman's carry, but he couldn't get enough leverage to get Jonas off the ground. The locusts, too tame a description for these revolting beasts, flew menacingly around Buck's head, and some even landed. He was astonished at their weight and thickness, and while he was relieved they didn't sting or bite, he heard their hisses and believed they were trying to drive him away from Jonas. When one hovered over Jonas's face, Buck snatched up the racket and stepped in a full-hand backhand, sending the locust rocketing through a window in the front of the house. The sensation of beast on strings felt as if he had smacked a toy metal car. His first order of business, if he ever got back into the house, was to board up that window and get rid of that animal. Buck tucked the racket under his arm and resorted to pulling Jonas by his wrist on his back up to the house. About 10 feet from the stairs, their progress stopped, and Buck discovered Jonas's waistband and belt had torn up grass as he slid. Buck spun him around and tucked the man's ankles under his own arms and kept going. When he reached the steps, he sucked it up, bent at the knees, and lifted Jonas up onto his shoulders. He believed the man outweighed him by 100 pounds. In the house, he plopped Jonas into a chair from which he clearly toppled before rousing enough to at least keep his balance. Another locust flew in before Buck could shut the door, and he smacked it with the racket as well. It skittered across the floor and rebounded off the wall, rattling as it rolled. It lay stunned, its segmented abdomen heaving. Buck's first target chose the moment to attack, and Buck knocked it out of the air again. He tried stepping on one and found its shell unbreakable. He nudged both under the face of the racket with his foot and shoved them out the door, slamming it shut before more could invade. He covered the broken window and helped the staggering Jonas to the front guest room. Then Jonas stretched out on the bed, incoherent and groaning, and tearing at the bottoms on his shirt. Knowing there was no remedy for the torture and agony the man would endure, Buck reluctantly left him and returned to the parlor upstairs. Like a person perversely drawn to a train track wreck, Buck wanted a close look at these things with a glass barrier between him and them. Before unlocking the door, Chaim demanded that Buck double and triple check that he was not accidentally bringing a locust in with him. Buck found Chaim shrouded in the beekeeper getup and welding the cricket bat, and demanding to know Jonas was still alive. Chaim grabbed Buck's arm and dragged him to the window. Angry locusts, trapped between glass and screen, were front and center, ready for study. Buck knew that any believer on the street had already suffered Jonas's fate, and that it couldn't be long. Buck knew that any unbeliever on the street had already suffered Jonas's fate, and it couldn't be long before the locusts would begin finding their way into homes and apartments. This was going to be the worst horror yet. And that is the end of chapter 16. And next I'll be reading chapter 17. And thank you for joining.